Tartt. Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Yee-haw, haw, haw, haw. All right, bruvs, we're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. Chapter 3 will commence here in seconds. These are long chapters, by the way. Or is this chapter 4? I think it's chapter 3. Took 140 pages, 138, 37 pages to get out of chapter 2, the pool hall. Sometimes before Ida went home for the evening, she set out something nice for supper. Casserole, fried chicken, sometimes even a pudding or cobbler. But tonight on the counter were only some leftovers that she wanted to get rid of. Ancient ham slices, pale and slimy from sitting around wrapped in plastic. Also some cold mashed potatoes. Harriet was furious. She opened the pantry and stared in at the 2 tidy shelves, lined with dim jars of flour and sugar, dried peas and cornmeal, macaroni and rice. Harriet's mother rarely ate more than a few spoonfuls of food in the evenings, and many nights she was happy with a dish of ice cream or a handful of soda crackers. Sometimes Allison scrambled eggs, but Harriet was a little sick of eggs all the time. Cobwebs of lassitude drifted over her. She snapped off a stick of spaghetti and sucked on it. The floury taste was familiar, like paste, and triggered an unexpected splutter of pictures from nursery school. Green tile floors, wooden blocks painted to look like bricks, windows too high to see out of. Lost in thought, still chewing on the splinter of dried spaghetti, her brow knotted cumbrously in a way that brought out her resemblance to Edie and Judge Cleve. Harriet dragged the chair to the refrigerator, maneuvering carefully to avoid setting off a landslide of newspaper. Gloomily, she climbed up and stood in it as she shifted through the crunching packages in the freezer compartment. But there was nothing good in the freezer either, only a carton of the disgusting peppermint stick ice cream that her mother loved. Many days, especially in the summertime, she ate nothing else. Buried in an avalanche of foil-wrapped lumps, the concept of convenience foods was foreign and preposterous to Ida Rue, who did the grocery shopping, TV dinners she thought unwholesome, though sometimes she bought them if they were on sale. Between meal snacks, she dismissed as a fad derived from television. Snock! What you want with a snock if you eat your dinner? Tell on her, Healy whispered when Harriet glumly joined him again on the back porch. She has to do what your mother says. Yeah, I know. Healy's mother had fired Roberta when Healy told on her for whipping him with a hairbrush. She had fired Ruby because she wouldn't let Healy watch Bewitched. Do it, do it. Healy bumped her foot with the toe of his sneaker. Later, but she said it only to save face. Harriet and Allison never complained about Ida, and more than once, even when Harriet was angry at Ida over some injustice, she'd lied and taken the blame herself, rather than get Ida in trouble. The simple fact was that things worked differently at Harriet's house than at Healy's. Healy, as had Pemberton before him, prided himself on being so difficult that their mother was unable to hold on to any housekeeper over a year or two. He and Pem had gone through nearly a dozen. What did Healy care if it was Roberta or Ramona or Shirley or Ruby or Essie Lee who was watching TV when he got home from school? But Ida stood at the firm center of Harriet's universe, beloved, grumbling, irreplaceable, with her large, kind hands and her great, moist, prominent eyes. Her smile, which was like the first smile that Harriet had ever seen in the world. It tormented Harriet to see how lightly her mother treated Ida sometimes, as if Ida was only passing through their lives and not fundamentally connected with them. Harriet's mother sometimes got hysterical and paced around the kitchen crying, and said things she didn't mean, though she was always sorry later, and the possibility of Ida being fired, or more likely getting mad and quitting, for Ida groused continually about how little Harriet's mother paid her, was so frightening that Harriet could not allow herself to think of it. Amongst the slippery tinfoil lumps, Harriet caught sight of a grape popsicle. With difficulty, she extricated it, thinking enviously of the deep freeze at Healy's house, which was crammed with fudgesicles and frozen pizzas. Chicken pot pies and every kind of TV dinner imaginable. With the popsicle, she went out to the porch without bothering to put the chair back where she'd got it, and lay on her back in the swing, reading the Jungle Book. Slowly, the color drained from the day. The rich greens of the garden faded to lavender, and as they dulled from lavender to purple black, the crickets began to shriek, and a couple of lightning bugs popped on and off, uncertainly, in the overgrown dark spot by Mrs. Fountain's fence. Good job, buddy. Absent-mindedly, Harriet let the popsicle stick fall to the floor from between her fingers. She had not moved for half an hour or more. The base of her skull was propped on the swing's wooden arm at a devilishly uncomfortable angle, but still she remained motionless except to draw the book closer and closer to her nose. Soon it was too dark to see. Harriet's scalp prickled, and there was a throbbing pressure behind her eyeballs, but she stayed where she was, stiff neck and all. Some parts of the Jungle Book she knew almost by heart. Mowgli's lessons with Bagheera and Baloo, the attack with Kaa upon the Bandar log, later less adventurous parts in which Mowgli began to be dissatisfied with his life in the jungle. She often did not read at all. She did not care for children's books in which the children grew up, as what growing up entailed in life as in books was a swift and inexplicable dwindling of character. Out of a clear blue sky, the heroes and heroines abandoned their adventures for some dull sweetheart, got married and had families, and generally started acting like a bunch of cows. Somebody was cooking steaks outside on a grill. They smelled good. Harriet's neck hurt in earnest, but even though she had the strain to see the darkening page, she was strangely reluctant to get up and switch on the light. Her attention slipped from the words to drift without purpose, mindlessly brushing along the top of the hedge opposite, as if along a length of scratchy black wool, until seized by the neck and marched back forcibly to the story. Deep in the jungle slumbered a ruined city, collapsed shrines, vine-choked tanks and terraces, decaying chambers full of gold and jewels about which no one, including Mowgli, gave a fig. Within the ruin dwelt the snakes that Kaa, the python, referred to, rather contemptuously as the poison people, And as she read on, Mowgli's jungle began to bleed stealthily into the humid, half-tropical darkness of her own backyard, infecting it with a wild, shadowy, dangerous feel. Frogs singing, birds screaming in the creeper-draped trees. Mowgli was a boy, but he was also a wolf, and she was herself, Harriet, but partly something else. Black wings glided over her, empty space. Harriet's thoughts sank and trailed into silence. Suddenly, she was not sure how long she had been lying in the swing. Why wasn't she in her bed? Was it later than she thought? A darkness slid across her mind. Black wind. Cold. She started so hard that the swing lurched, something flapping in her face, something oily, struggling. She couldn't get her breath. Frantically, she slapped and batted at the air, floundering in space and the swing creaking and not knowing which way was up or down until somewhere in the back of her mind she realized the bang she just heard was her library book fallen to the floor. Harriet stopped struggling and lay still. The swing's violent rocking slowed again and quieted, the boards of the porch ceiling sweeping slower and slower overhead, and at last coming to a stop. In the glassy stillness, she lay there, thinking, if she hadn't come along, the bird would have died anyway, but that didn't change the fact that it was she who had actually killed it. The library book lay open and face up upon the floorboards. She rolled on her stomach to reach for it. A car swung around the corner and down George Street, and as the headlights swept across the porch, an illustration of the white cobra was illumined, like a road sign flashing up suddenly at night with the caption beneath, "They came to take the treasure away many years ago. I spoke to them in the dark, and they lay still." Harriet rolled back over and lay very still for a number of minutes. She stood creakily and stretched her arms over her head. Then she limped inside, through the too bright dining room, where Allison sat alone at the dining room table, eating cold mashed potatoes from a white bowl. "Be still, O little one, for I am death." Another cobra had said that in something else by Kipling, not Kibling. The cobras in his stories were heartless, but they spoke beautifully, like wicked kings in the Old Testament. Harriet walked through to the kitchen, to the wall phone, and dialed Healy's house. 4 rings, 5, then someone picked up. Gabby. Gabble of noise in the background. "No, you look better without it," said Healy's mother to someone, and then into the receiver. "Hello? It's Harriet. May I speak to Healy, please?" "Harriet, of course you can, sweet pea." The receiver dropped. Harriet, her eyes still unaccustomed to the light, blinked at the dining room chair, which still stood by the refrigerator. Healy's mother, little nicknames and endearments always caught her by surprise. Sweet pea was not the kind of thing that people generally called Harriet. Commotion, a scraped chair, Pemberton's insinuating laughter, Healy's irritated whine rose above it piercingly. A door slammed. "Hey!" His voice was gruff but excited. "Harriet?" She caught the receiver between her ear and shoulder and turned to face the wall. "Healy, if we tried, do you think we could catch a poisonous snake?" There was an awestruck silence, during which Harriet realized with pleasure he understood exactly what she was getting at. Copperheads, cottonmouths, which is more poisonous? It was several hours later, and they were sitting on the back steps of Harriet's house in the dark. Healy had gone nearly berserk, waiting for the birthday excitement to die down so he could slip out and meet her. His mother, made suspicious by his vanished appetite, had leapt to the humiliating assumption that he was constipated and had hovered for ages, querying him about his toilet intimacies, offering him laxatives. After she'd finally kissed him goodnight reluctantly and gone upstairs with his father, he'd lain open-eyed and stiff beneath the covers for half an hour or more, as zinged up as he'd drunk a gallon of Coca-Cola, as if he'd just seen the new James Bond movie, as if it was Christmas Eve. Sneaking out of the house, tiptoeing down the hall, easing the squeaky back door open an inch at a time, had zinged him up even more. After the purring, air-conditioned chill of his bedroom, the night air pressed heavy and very hot. His hair was stuck to the back of his neck, and he couldn't quite catch his breath. Harriet, on the step below, sat with her knees under her chin, eating a cold chicken leg that he'd brought her from his house. "What's the difference between a cottonmouth and a copperhead?" she said. Her lips in the moonlight were slightly greasy from the chicken. "I thought it was all just one damn snake," said Healy. He felt delirious. Copperheads are different. It's cottonmouths and water moccasins that are the same snake. A water moccasin will attack you if it feels like it, said Healy, gladly repeating word for word something Pemberton had said to him a couple of hours earlier when Healy had questioned him. Healy was deathly afraid of snakes and did not even like to look at pictures of snakes in the encyclopedia. They're real aggressive. Do they stay in the water all the time? A copperhead is about 2 feet long, real thin, real red, said Healy, repeating something else that Pemberton had said, since he didn't know the answer to her question. They don't like the water. Would he be easier to catch? Oh, yeah, said Healy, though he had no idea. Whenever Healy came across a snake, he knew, unerringly, regardless of size or color, from the point or roundness of its head, whether it was poisonous or not. But that was as far as his knowledge went. All his life he had called all poisonous snakes moccasin, and any poisonous snake on land was, in his mind, simply a water moccasin that wasn't in water at the moment. Harriet threw the chicken bone off the side of the steps, and after wiping her fingers on her bare shins, opened the paper towel and began to eat the slice of birthday cake Healy had brought. Neither child spoke for some moments. Even in the daytime, a dingy, shut-up vapor of neglect hung over Harriet's backyard, which was tarnished-looking somehow, and colder than the other yards on George Street. And at night, when the sags and tangles and rats' nests of vegetation blackened and massed together, it practically twitched with hidden life. Mississippi was full of snakes. All their lives, Healy and Harriet had heard stories of fishermen bitten by cottonmouths, twining up paddles or tumbling into canoes from low, overhanging trees of plumbers and exterminators, and furnace repairmen bitten beneath houses of water, skiers toppling in the submerged nests of moccasins, floating up blotched and glassy-eyed, swollen so tight that they bobbed in the wash of the motorboat like blow-up pool toys. They both knew not to walk in the woods in the summer without boots and long pants, never to turn over big rocks or step over big logs without looking first on the other side, to stay away from tall grass and brush piles and swampy water and culverts and crawl spaces and suspicious holes. Healy reflected not without discomfort on his mother's repeated warnings to be careful of the overgrown hedges, the dank, long-abandoned goldfish pond, and the rotted lumber piles in Harriet's yard. It's not her fault, she said. Her mother doesn't keep the place cleaned up like she should. Just don't you let me catch you running around barefoot over there. There's a nest of snakes, little red ones, like you say, under the hedge. Chester says they're poison. Last winter, when the ground froze, I found a ball of them, like so. She drew a softball-sized circle in midair, with ice on them. Who's scared of dead snakes? They weren't dead. Chester said they'd come to life if they thawed out. Ugh. He set the whole ball of them on fire. It was a memory that had stayed with Harriet a little too vividly. In her mind's eye, she could still see Chester, in high boots, splashing the snakes with gasoline out in the flat, wintry yard, holding the gas can from his body at arm's length, and after he threw the match, the flame was a surreal orange ball that cast no warmth or light upon the dull, greeny black of the hedge behind. Even at that distance, the snakes had seemed to writhe, glowing suddenly into a horrible life. And one in particular had separated its head from the mass and weaved back and forth blindly like a windshield wiper on a car. As they burned, they'd made a hideous crackling noise, one of the worst noises Harriet had ever heard. All the rest of that winter and most of the spring, there'd been a small pile of greasy ash and blackened vertebrae in the spot. Absent-mindedly, she picked up the piece of birthday cake, then put it down again. That kind of snake, she said. Chester told me you can't really get rid of them. They might go away for a little while if you really get after them, but once they get to living in a place and liking it, they'll come back sooner or later. Healy was thinking of all the times that he had taken the shortcut through the hedge without his shoes on. Aloud, he said, "Do you know that reptile playland out on the old highway? Near the petrified forest? It's a gas station, too. Creepy old hairlip guy runs it." Harriet turned to stare at him. "You been there?" "Yep. You mean your mother stopped there?" "Gosh, no," said Healy, slightly embarrassed. "Just Pem and me on the way back from a ball game. Even Pemberton, even Pem, had not really seemed all that keen on stopping at the reptile playland. They'd been low on gas. I never knew anybody who actually went there. Come on. There we go. The man there is scary. He's got tattoos and snakes all up and down his arms, and scars too, like he'd been bitten plenty of times. Healy had noticed while he was filling up the tank, and no teeth and no dentures either, which had given his grin a soft, horrible snake-like quality. Worst of all, a boa constrictor had been twined around his neck. "Want to pet him, son?" he'd said, leaning into the car, pinning Healy with his flat, sun-dazzled eyes. "What's it like, the reptile playland?" "Stinks, like fish. I touched the boa constrictor," he added. He'd been afraid not to. He'd been afraid that the snake man might throw it on him if he didn't. It was cold like a car seat in winter. "How many snakes does he have?" "Oh man, snakes and fish tanks, this whole wall of them. Then a ton more of snakes just laying out free." Out in this fence part called the Rattlesnake Ranch, there was another building out in the back with words and pictures and junk painted all over the sides. What kept them from climbing out? I don't know. They weren't moving around too much. They looked sort of sick. I don't want a sick snake. A strange thought struck Healy. What if Harriet's brother hadn't died when she was little? If he was alive, he might be like Pemberton, teasing her, messing with her stuff. She probably wouldn't even like him much. He pulled his yellow hair up in a ponytail with one hand, fanned the back of his neck with the other. "I'd rather have a slow snake than one of those fast ones that follow your ass," he said cheerfully. "One time I saw on TV about black mambas. They're about 10 feet long. And what do is they raise up on their first 8 feet and chase after you about 20 miles an hour with their mouths wide open. And when they catch you," he said, raising his voice over Harriet's, "what they do is they hit you right in the face." "Does he have one of those?" "He has every snake in the world. Plus, I forgot to say, they're so poisonous you die in 10 seconds. Forget about the snake bite, Kit. You have had it." Harriet's silence was overpowering. With her dark hair and her arms around her knees, she looked like a little Chinese pirate. "You know what we need?" she said presently. "A car." "Yeah," said Healy brightly after a sharp, stunned pause, cursing himself for bragging to her that he knew how to drive. He glanced at her sideways, then leaned back stiff-armed on his palms and looked at the stars. Can't or no was never what you wanted to have to say to Harriet. He had seen her jump off rooftops, attack kids twice her size, kick and bite the nurses during the 5-in-1 booster inoculations in kindergarten. Not knowing what to say, he rubbed his eyes. He was sleepy, but unpleasantly so, hot and prickly, and like he was going to have nightmares. He thought of the skinned rattlesnake he'd seen hanging from a fence post at the reptile playland, red, muscular, twined with blue veins. "Harriet," he said aloud, "wouldn't it be easier to call the cops?" "It would be a lot easier," she said without missing a beat, and he felt a wave of affection for her. Good old Harriet. You could snap your fingers and change the subject just like that, and there she was. She stayed right with you. 141. Okay. "I think that's what we should do then. We can call from that payphone by City Hall and say we know who killed your brother. I know how to talk in a voice exactly like an old woman." Harriet looked at him like he was insane. "Why should I let other people punish him?" she said. The expression on her face made him uncomfortable. Healy glanced away, his eyes lit on the greasy paper towel on the steps, with the half-eaten cake lying on top of it. For the truth of the situation was that he would do whatever she asked of him, whatever it was, and they both knew it. The copperhead was small, only a little over a foot long, and by far the smallest of the 5 that Healy and Harriet had spotted that morning within the space of an hour. It was lying very quietly in a slack S shape, and some sparse weeds coming up through a layer of builder's sand just off the cul-de-sac in Oak Lawn Estates, a housing development out past the country club. All the houses in Oak Lawn were less than 7 years old, mock Tudor, blocky ranch, and contemporary, even a couple of fake antebellum of new, spanking red brick with ornamental columns tacked onto their facades. Though big and fairly expensive, their newness gave them a raw, unfriendly feel. In the back of the subdivision, where Healy and Harriet had parked their bicycles, many of the houses were still under construction, barren, staken off plots stacked with tar paper and lumber, sheetrock and insulation, bracketed with skeletons of new yellow pine through which the sky streamed a feverish blue. Unlike shady old George Street, built before the turn of the century, there were few trees of any size and no sidewalks at all. Virtually every scrap of vegetation had toppled to the chainsaw and the bulldozer. Water oaks, post oaks, some of which, according to an arborist from the State University who led a doomed attempt to save them, were standing when LaSalle came down the Mississippi River in 1682. Most of the topsoil their roots had held in place had washed into the creek and down the river. The hard pan had been bulldozed down into low-lying areas to make the land level, and little would grow in the poor, sour-smelling earth that was left. Grass sprouted sparsely, if at all. The trucked-in magnolias and dogwoods withered swiftly and died down to sticks, protruding from hopeful circles of mulch and decorative edging. The baked expanses of clay, red as Mars, littered with sand and sawdust, butted starkly against the very margin of the asphalt, which was so black and so new that it still looked sticky. Behind, to the south, lay a teeming marsh, which rose and flooded the development each spring. The houses in Oak Lawn Estates were mostly owned by up-and-comers, developers and politicians and real estate agents, ambitious young marrieds fleeing sharecropper origins in the towns of the piney woods or the clay hills. As if in hatred for their rural origins, they had methodically paved over every available surface and ripped out every native tree. But Oak Lawn had taken its own revenge at being planned so brutally flat. The land was swampy and whining with mosquitoes, holes filled with brackish water as soon as they were dug in the ground. The sewage backed up when it rained, legendary black sludge that rose in the spanking new commodes, dripped from the faucets in the fancy multiple spray shower heads. With all the topsoil sliced away, truckloads and truckloads of sand had to be brought in to keep the houses from washing away in the spring, and there was nothing to stop turtles and snakes from crawling as far inland from the river as they pleased. And Oak Lawn Estates was infested with snakes, big and small, poisonous or not, snakes that liked mud, and snakes that liked water, and snakes that liked to bask on dry rocks in the sunshine. As the reek of snake rose up from the very ground, just as murky water rose to fill footprints in the bulldozed earth. Ida Rue compared the smell of snake musk to fish guts, buffalo carp, mud or channel cat, scavenger fish that fed off garbage. Edie, when digging a hole for an azalea or a rose bush, particularly in garden club civic plantings near the interstate, said she knew her spade was close to a snake's nest if she caught a whiff of something like rotten potatoes. Harriet had smelled snake stink herself plenty of times, most strongly in the reptile house at the Memphis Zoo, and from frightened snakes imprisoned in gallon jars in the science classroom, but also wafting acrid and resty from murky creek banks and shallow lakes. From culverts and steaming mudflats in August, and every now and then, in very hot weather after a rain, in her own yard. Harriet's jeans and her long-sleeved shirt were soaked with sweat. Since there were scarcely any trees in the subdivision or the marsh behind, she wore a straw hat to keep from getting sunstroke. But the sun beat down white and fierce like the very wrath of God. She felt faint with heat and apprehension. All morning long she had maintained a stoic front, while Healy, who was too proud to wear a hat and had the start of a blistering sunburn, skipped about and babbled intermittently about a James Bond movie which had to do with drug rings and fortune tellers and deadly tropical snakes. On the bike ride out, he bored her to death by gabbing about the stunt rider Evel Knievel and a Saturday morning cartoon called Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch. You should have seen it, he was saying now, raking back with agitated repetitiveness the dripping strings of hair that fell in his face. Oh man, James Bond, he burned that snake right up. he's got a can of deodorant or something. So when he sees the snake in the mirror, he spins around like this and holds his cigar up to the spray can, and pow, that fire shoots out across the room like this. Whoosh! He staggered backward, trilling his lips, while Harriet considered the dozing copperhead and tried hard to think how they should proceed. They had set off hunting equipped with Healy's BB gun, 2 whittled, forked sticks, a field guide to reptiles and amphibians of the southeastern United States, Chester's garden gloves, a tourniquet, a pocket knife, and change for a phone call in case either of them was bitten, and an old tin lunchbox of Allison's. Pardon? Campus queen painted with ponytailed cheerleaders and pert beauty contestants in tiaras, into the lid of which Harriet, with difficulty, had poked a few air holes with a screwdriver. The plan was to sneak up. Oh my God, this goes on forever. A long time to read here. Was to sneak up on the snake, preferably after it struck, before it recollected itself, and pin it behind the head with the forked stick. They would then grab it close behind the head, very close, so it couldn't snap around and bite, and throw it in the lunchbox and buckle it shut. But all this was easier said than done. The first snakes they'd spotted, 3 young copperheads, rust red and glistening, roasting themselves all together on a concrete slab. They'd been too scared to approach. Healy tossed a chunk of brick in their midst. 2 darted off in opposite directions. The remaining one was infuriated and began to strike, low and repeatedly, at the brick, at the air, at anything that caught its attention. Both children were horrified, circling cagily, forked sticks at arm's length. They darted quickly towards it, and just as quickly back when the thing whipped around to strike, first on one side, then the other, fighting them off in all directions. Harriet was so frightened that she felt she might black out. Healy jabbed at it and missed. The snake whipped back and lashed at him its full length, and Harriet, with a stifled cry, pinned the back of its head with the forked stick. Immediately, with shocking violence, it began to thrash the remaining 2 feet of its length as if possessed by the devil. Harriet, flabbergasted with revulsion, leapt back to keep its tail from slapping her legs with a wriggle. The thing muscled free toward Healy, who danced back and shrieked like he'd been impaled with an iron spike, and shot into the parched weeds. One thing about Oak Lawn Estates, if a child or anyone had screamed long and high and hard like that on George Street, Mrs. Fountain, Mrs. Godfrey, Ida Rue, and a half-dozen housekeepers would have flown outside in a heartbeat. Children, leave that snake alone. Scat! And they would mean business and not stand for any backtalk, and stand watch at their kitchen windows after they went back inside just to make sure. But things were different at Oak Lawn Estates. The houses had a frightening sealed-off quality, like bunkers or mausoleums. People didn't know each other. Out here at Oak Lawn, you could scream your head off. Some convict could be strangling you with a piece of barbed wire, and nobody would come outside to see what was going on. In the intense, heat-vibrant silence, manic laughter from a TV game show wafted eerily from the nearest house. A shuttered hacienda hunched defensively in a raw plot just beyond the pine skeletons. Dark windows, a gleaming new Buick was parked in the sand-strewn carport. Ann Kendall, come on down. Wild audience applause. Who was in that house? Thought Harriet, dazed, shading her eyes with one hand. A drunk dad who hadn't gone to his job? Some sluggish junior league mother like the sloppy young mothers that Allison sometimes babysat for out here, lying in a darkened room with the TV on and the laundry undone? I can't stand The Price is Right, said Healy, stumbling backwards with a little moan and looking on the ground with an agitated, jerky movement as he did so. They have money and cars on Tattletales. I like Jeopardy. Healy wasn't listening. Energetically, he thrashed about in the weeds with his forked stick. From Russia with love, he crooned, and then again, because he couldn't remember the words, from Russia with love. They had not long to look before finding a fourth snake, a moccasin, waxy, liver yellow, no longer in its body than the copperheads, but thicker than Harriet's arm. Healy, who despite his apprehension insisted upon leading the way, nearly stepped on it. Like a spring, it popped up and struck, just missing his calf. Healy, his reflexes electrified by the previous encounter, lunged back and pinned it in one stab. "Ha!" he shouted. Harriet laughed aloud. With trembling hands, she fumbled with the catch of the Campus Queen lunchbox. The snake was slower and less nimble. Testily, it swept its thick body, an awful corrupt yellow, back and forth across the ground, but it was much larger than the copperheads. Would it fit in the Campus Queen? Healy, so terrified that he was laughing too, high and hysterical, spread his fingers and bent to grab it. "The head!" cried Harriet, dropping the lunchbox with a clatter. Healy jumped back. The stick fell from his hand. The moccasin lay still. Then very smoothly it pulled its head up and regarded them with its slitted pupils for a long, ice-cold moment before it opened its mouth, eerie white inside, and went for them. They turned and ran, knocking into each other, afraid of stumbling in a ditch, and yet too afraid to look at the ground, with the undergrowth crashing beneath their sneakers and the smell of trampled bitterweed eddying up pungent all around them, in the heat like the smell of fear itself. A ditch filled with brackish water that squiggled with tadpoles cut them off from the asphalt. The concrete sides were slick and mossy, too wide to clear with a single leap. They skidded down. The smell they churned up, sewage and fishy rot, catapulted them both into an ecstasy of coughing, fell forward on their hands, scrambled up to the other side. When they heaved themselves up and turned, tears streaming down their faces, to look back at the way they'd just come, they saw only the path they'd beaten through the yellow-flowered scraggle of bitterweed and the melancholy pastels of the dropped lunchbox, farther back. Panting, beet red, exhausted, they swayed like drunks. Though they both felt as if they might pass out, the ground was neither comfortable nor safe, and there was no place else to sit. A tadpole large enough to have legs and had splashed out of the ditch and was stranded, twitching, on the road, and its flip-flops, its slimy skin rasping against the asphalt, bumped Harriet into a fresh fit of gagging. Mindless of their usual grammar school etiquette, which kept them rigidly 2 feet apart, except to shove or punch, they clung to each other for balance. Harriet without thought of looking a coward, Healy without thought of trying to kiss her or scare her. Their jeans, clustered with burrs, sticky with beggar's lice, were unpleasantly heavy, soaked and stinking with the ditch water. Healy, bent double, was making noises like he might vomit. "Are you okay?" said Harriet, and retched when she saw on his sleeve a yellow-green clot of tadpole guts. Healy, gagging repetitively, like a cat trying to bring up a hairball, shrugged away and started back to retrieve the dropped stick and the lunchbox. Harriet caught the back of his sweat-soaked shirt. "Hang on," she managed to say. They sat astraddle their bicycles to rest. Healy's Stingray with the goat horn handlebars and the banana seat, Harriet's Western Flyer, which had been Robin's, both breathing hard and not talking. After the banging of their hearts had slowed and they each had swallowed a grim little drink of lukewarm, plastic-tasting water from Healy's canteen, they set out into the field again, this time armed with Healy's BB rifle. Healy's stunned silence had given way to theatrics. Loudly, with dramatic gestures, he bragged about how he was going to catch the water moccasin and what he was going to do to it when he caught it. Shoot it in the face, swing it in the air, snap it like a whip, chop it in two, ride over the pieces with his bicycle. His face was scarlet, his breath fast and shallow. Every now and then, he fired a shot into the weeds and had to stop and pump ferociously on the air rifle, huff, 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 to work his pressure up again. They had shunned the ditch and were heading toward the houses under construction, where it was easier to clamber up onto the road if they were menaced. Harriet's head ached, and her hands felt cold and sticky. Healy, the BB gun swinging from the strap across his shoulder, paced back and forth, jabbering, punching at the air, oblivious to the quiet part, in the thin grass not 3 feet from his sneaker, where lay unobtrusively in a nearly straight line what reptiles and amphibians of the southeast United States would call a juvenile copperhead. So this briefcase that shoots tear gas when you open it, well, it's got bullets too and a knife that pops out the side. Harriet's head felt swimmy. She wished that she had $1 for every time she'd heard Healy talk about the briefcase and From Russia with Love that shot bullets and tear gas. She closed her eyes and said, "Listen, you grabbed that other snake too low. he would have bit you. Shut up, cried Healy after a moment's angry pause. It's your fault. I had him. If you hadn't, watch out behind you. Moccasin. He crouched and swung the gun round. Where? Show me the son of a bitch. There, said Harriet, and then, stepping forward in exasperation to point again. There! Blindly, the pointed head wove up, exposing the pale underside of its muscled jaw, then settled again with a sort of sifting movement. Geez, that's just a little one, said Healy, disappointed, leaning forward to peer at it. It doesn't matter how. Hey, she said, skipping awkwardly to the side as the copperhead struck out at her ankle in a red streak. A shower of boiled peanuts flew past, and then the whole plastic bag of them sailed over her shoulder and plopped to the ground. Harriet was staggering, off balance, and hopping on one foot, and then the copperhead, whose whereabouts she'd momentarily lost track of, popped out at her again. A BB pinged harmlessly against her sneaker. Another stung her calf, and she yelped and jumped back as they cracked in the dust around her feet. But the snake was excited now, vigorously pressing its attack, even under fire. Repeatedly, it struck at her feet, lashing out again and again with stringent aim. Dizzy, half delirious, she scrambled to the asphalt. She smeared her forearm across her face, transparent blobs pulsing merrily across her sun-dazed vision, bumping and merging like magnified amoebas in a drop of pond water. And as her sight cleared, she became aware that the little copperhead had lifted his head and was regarding her without surprise or emotion from a distance of about 4 feet. Healy, in his frenzy, had jammed the BB gun. Shouting nonsense, he dropped it and ran to get the stick. Wait a minute. With a tug of effort, she pulled free from the snake's icy glaze. Clear as church bells. What's wrong with me? She thought, weakly, stumbling back into the shimmering center of the road. Heat stroke? Oh, geez, Healy's voice coming from the side. Coming from, she didn't know where. Harriet! Wait, hardly aware of what she was doing. Her knees were loose and clumsily, like they belonged to a marionette. She didn't know how to work. She stepped back again and then sat down hard on the hot asphalt. You okay, dude? Leave me alone, Harriet heard herself say. The sun sizzled red through her closed eyelids. An afterburn of the snake's eyes glowed against them, in malevolent negative, black for the iris, acid yellow for the slashed pupil. She was breathing through her mouth, and the odor of her sewage-soaked trousers was so strong in the heat that she could taste it. Suddenly, she realized that she wasn't safe on the ground. She tried to scramble to her feet, but the ground slid away. Harriet, Healy's voice a long way off. What's the matter? You're freaking me out. She blinked. The white light stung. The lemon juice squirted in her eyes, and it was horrible to be so hot and so blind and so confused in her arms and legs. The next thing she knew, she was lying on her back. The sky blazed a cloudless, heartless blue. Time seemed to have skipped a half beat, as if she dozed and awakened with the snap of her head in the same instant. A heavy presence darkened her vision. Panic-stricken, she threw both arms over her face, but the hovering darkness only shifted and pressed in, more insistently from the other side. Come on, Harriet, it's just water, she heard the words in the back of her mind, and yet did not hear them. Then, quite unexpectedly, something cold touched the corner of her mouth, and Harriet floundered away from it, screaming as loudly as she could. And that's going to be all for now.